On certain winter nights, when the house is quiet and the glass of the window turns black as coal, you can feel the mind reaching for shapes. A movement in the corner of your eye, a face in the reflection, a fraction too late. And there is an old fear underneath it all, a fear older than mirrors, older than portraits. The fear that you might not be entirely alone inside your own life. Across Europe, people gave that fear a name: doppelgänger, a double walker, a second self. Not a twin of flesh and blood, but an echo that steps out of you and stands at your shoulder and makes the world feel suddenly wrong. Tonight's story is one of the most famous doppelganger accounts ever recorded. It is not a fairy tale, not exactly. It arrives to us through testimony, through names, dates, a place you can still point to on a map. And at the center of it is a French teacher, far from home, trying to do a simple job. Her name was Émilie Sagée. And if the witnesses were telling the truth, Émilie Sagée sometimes appeared twice. We begin in the 1840s in Livonia, a Baltic province of the Russian Empire, where German-speaking nobles held estates and where boarding schools trained young ladies in languages, needlework, manners, and music. Near the town of Volmar, known today as Valmiera in Latvia, there stood a girls' school, commonly referred to as the Pensionnat of Livonia. Their surviving story tells us there were 42 pupils, mostly daughters of noble Livonian families. And among those girls, the account says, was a 13-year-old baron's daughter named Julie de Goldenstube. In 1845, the school hired a new French teacher, Mademoiselle Émilie Sagée, described in the testimony as 32 years old and originally from Dijon. She was, by all reports, competent, amiable, quiet, good-tempered. Not a woman who courted attention. Not a woman who made enemies. Just a teacher. But she carried a strange history with her, a detail the story returns to like a drumbeat in the dark. By the time she arrived at Livonia, Émilie had supposedly held 18 teaching positions in 16 years. A new post, a new school, a new beginning, again and again and again. And soon enough, Livonia would learn why. A few weeks after Émilie arrived, the girls began to whisper. Nothing dramatic at first, just the small confusions that happen in any busy house. One student thought she saw Mademoiselle Sagée in one corridor. Another insisted she passed her on the stairs at the same moment. Little contradictions, little mistimings, the kind of thing you shrug off until you can't. Then came the lesson at the blackboard. The class was small that day, 13 pupils, the account tells us, including Julie de Goldenstube. Emily stood with her back to them, chalk in hand, writing, and then, without warning, the girls saw it. Another Émilie Sagée, standing beside the first. Not a blur, not a trick of candlelight, not a smudge of tired eyes. A second figure, identical in appearance, mirroring the teacher's movements, as though the body had been copied and set down beside itself. The difference, they said, was small but chilling. The real Emily held chalk. The double did not. The real wrote words onto the board. The double simply imitated the motion, an empty hand tracing letters that weren't there. And the most unsettling part, Emily did not react. She continued teaching as if nothing had changed, as if she could not feel the second presence beside her, as if the room contained only one of her. Imagine being 13 years old, sitting in a quiet classroom and watching your teacher split into two, not like a magic trick and not like a story, but like an accident of reality, a seam opening in the air. Not long after, there was another incident. Smaller, more domestic, and perhaps for that reason even worse. A pupil named Antoine Derange was being helped with her dress. Emily stood beside her, fastening hooks, adjusting fabric, ordinary motherly work. Antoine happened to turn her head, and in a mirror nearby, she saw the scene behind her. Two Mademoiselles Sagée, both standing close, both working at the dress, two sets of hands at the same task. In some tellings, the girl faints. In others, she simply panics. What the core accounts preserves is this: the double appeared again, not as a distant illusion, but close enough to share the same space, close enough to be mistaken for the real woman if you saw it from the corner of your eye. And once you've seen a thing like that, once you've had the certainty of your own eyes turned against you, it changes the way you experience a room. Because after that, every reflection becomes suspect. Every window at night becomes a possible doorway. And every time Emily enters, part of you waits for the second step. The most famous episode in the Sagée story happens not in a hidden corridor, not in the hush of night, but in a bright, ordinary hour, which is often how the truly disturbing things begin. The girls were assembled in a spacious hall, working at long tables, embroidery, as the account specifically says. Through the windows, they could see into the garden, and out there was Émilie Sagée, gathering flowers, something she was said to love. Inside the room, another teacher supervised the pupils. After a time, that supervising teacher left the room, and her armchair sat empty at the head of the hall. For a moment, nothing happened. The girls stitched. The air held that soft indoor quiet. Thread pulled through cloth, the faint scrape of chair legs, a distant bird outside, and then the armchair was no longer empty. A figure appeared seated in it. Émilie Sagée, silent, still, sitting as though she'd been there all along. The girls looked at each other, then they looked back to the garden. And there she was. The real Émilie, still outside among the flower beds. Two Émilies, visible at the same time. One in the garden, moving slowly, languidly, the account says, like someone exhausted or half asleep, and one in the chair, motionless, like a statue that had learned to breathe. This wasn't a single witness. This wasn't one frightened girl with a lively imagination. This, the historian insists, happened in a room with the entire body of pupils present. 42 sets of eyes. Now, if you were there, if you were sitting at one of those tables with thread between your fingers, what would you do? Would you stare? Would you look away and pretend you saw nothing? Would you pray? The account tells us that by this point, the girls had become used to the phenomenon, used to it in the way you can become used to living near a cliff edge, where the drop is always there, but you stop looking down. Two of the boldest girls stood up, and they walked towards the armchair, slowly, like people approaching a wild animal that might bolt, or a painting that might suddenly turn its head. One of the girls reached out. Her hand met something, not nothing, not air. A resistance, slight but noticeable. Then the second girl did something even worse. She stepped closer and passed partly through the figure, through the portion of Émilie that sat in the chair. The double did not flinch. It did not turn. It did not defend itself like a living thing. It did not recoil like smoke. It simply remained. A seated, woman-shaped presence that allowed the world to move through it, as though it were made of thin fabric stretched over absence. After a time, the figure faded, gradually, not vanishing in a flash, but thinning as if the room were slowly deciding it had made a mistake. And at that moment, it disappeared. The girls looked again to the garden. They saw Émilie Sagée straighten. They saw her movements quicken. They saw her return to all her usual activity, as though the weight that had been on her shoulders had lifted. There is a particular dread in that detail, because it suggests the double was not simply beside her, but connected to her. that when it was strong, she was weak, and when it left, she recovered. If you are the kind of person who believes in spirits, you might call it a draining. If you are the kind of person who believes in psychology, you might think of suggestion, exhaustion, mass perception, misremembered timings. But whatever explanation you reach for, you still have to sit with the image. A chair at the head of a school hall, a teacher in the garden, and inside, a second teacher-shaped thing waiting in silence. The story says the phenomenon continued for the entire time Émilie remained at Neuvilke, spanning 1845 to 1846, and it began to have consequences. Not supernatural consequences, not curses, not sudden deaths, but the slow, grinding consequences of fear in a community that depends on reputation. Parents heard what their daughters were saying. Letters would have been written. Conversations would have happened behind closed doors. A headmistress would have smiled politely and felt her stomach drop. Because even if she doubted the girls, even if she suspected exaggeration, she still had the same problem. 42 pupils become 30. 30 become 20. And a school becomes a rumor. The account claims that after about 18 months, only 12 of the 42 pupils remained. And because of that, Émilie Sagée was asked to resign. Not because she'd harmed anyone, not because she'd been unkind, but because the school could not afford her. Not with that second version of her walking through the halls. When she was asked to resign, the testimony preserves a line, brief, bitter, and terribly human. It says Émilie exclaimed something like, "Ah, the 19th time, it is very, very hard to bear." Meaning, this had happened before. Meaning, she had been moved on again and again, not for her teaching, but for what followed her. And if that line is true, then perhaps the most tragic part of the story is that Émilie wasn't a woman cursed to see ghosts. She was a woman cursed to be seen. After she left the school, the story says Émilie went to live with a sister-in-law, a woman with several small children. And the double followed her there too. The children, aged 3 or 4, were said to remark casually that they saw 2 Aunt Émilies. That detail is almost worse than the schoolroom, because children don't usually have the patience for elaborate hoaxes. They don't care about reputation. They don't care about doppelgangers. They point at what they think they see, and then they ask for bread and butter. And if they were truly saying it, if that part of the testimony is accurate, then the phenomenon wasn't confined to a hall full of impressionable pupils. It wasn't just a school story. It was domestic. It was intimate. It walked into the kitchen. Then, the account tells us, Émilie set out for the interior of Russia. Émilie Sagée becomes what so many people in old accounts become. A name, a shadow, a woman who steps off the edge of the page. We hold the lantern up to the record because the story is famous, and fame has a way of smoothing over cracks. The earliest major publication of the Sagée case is from 1860 in a book by Robert Dale Owen titled Footfalls on the Boundary of Another World. Owen said he received the narrative from a direct witness, Julie de Goldenstube. Even when you account for all the weaknesses in the record, even when you admit the distance of time, even when you accept that some stories survive because people want them to be true, there is something about Émilie Sagée that lingers, because it isn't a monster story. It isn't a tale of claw marks on the door. It is something colder, something more personal. A woman trying to earn her living, losing job after job because other people kept seeing a second version of her. A woman who, if she ever guessed the truth, could do nothing about it. And that is the final dread, really. Not that a ghost might follow you, but that you might follow you. That somewhere in the same room, in the same hour, in the same life, a second, you might stand up quietly and begin to copy your movements. With empty hands and no chalk and no shadow, will you carry on unaware? And if you listen carefully in the dark, not for footsteps in the hall, but for the sound of a second step, you may understand why the old Europeans feared the double more than the dead. Because the dead are finished, but the double is still walking.